Today's founder is the Impartial Examiner II. Again, the Impartial Examiner is a series of Anti-Federalist papers written by an unknown Virginian attempting to get the state of Virginia to not ratify the United States Constitution. And oh boy, was it close. Now, we do know Virginia does end up ratifying the Constitution, but it's still fun to look at what people were saying that was so bad about it. The Impartial Examiner, these are longer than most Anti-Federalist essays, and I'm going to sum it up as briefly as I can, but the main meat of the second letter of the Impartial Examiner discusses the general good. Now, the general good is also referred to in the Constitution itself under, general welfare, and the Impartial Examiner is saying, well, when the separate states are responding to the citizens, they're pretty good at determining what those citizens need. But the entire country, all these 13 different states under one government, there's such an array of opinions and ideas and needs and desires of the different citizens that they will not all be able to get the maximized amount of general good out of such a large government. And in fact, the Impartial Examiner was afraid that the opposite effect would happen, where representatives of the different states would have to fight so hard for the general good of their state that it would actually adversely affect the general good of the United States at large. He goes into a lot more detail about it than I just did, but he then bounces around to a few other topics which we've heard in discussions from other Anti-Federalists. He looks at the federal government's ability to raise taxes. The Examiner is afraid that this ability to raise taxes will put citizens in a situation where they owe more money to the federal government than they actually could make, and they'd be essentially enslaved by this debt, because not only could they not pay this off, but because there was no trial by jury, they could just be taken and imprisoned. Now, I know you might be thinking, there is trial by jury, but no, that's part of the Bill of Rights. And when these papers were written against the Constitution itself, there were no Bill of Rights, there were no First 10 Amendments, and there was no trial by jury, something many, many Anti-Federalists were very afraid of. In the same paper, the Impartial Examiner continues to talk about standing armies, and in very brief, he does a long summation of it. I am doing a very short one. What he really picks out about standing armies that I found interesting is the Examiner points out that soldiers are meant to soldier. They are meant to fight. And if there's an army full of soldiers, well, the army is going to look out for its soldiers, as it rightfully should. But what soldiers want to do is fight, and the army will be pushing the government in a direction, or at least doing its best to sway decisions to continue as many wars and hostilities as possible to give its soldiers something to soldier about. Lastly, in this second Impartial Examiner, the Examiner goes on to review the powers of the Supreme Court. Again, we've discussed the Supreme Court with other Anti-Federalists, but it's worth a review. He very much doesn't like that the Judicial Department's regulations are actually supposed to be set up by Congress. The Judicial Department still is essentially controlled by Congress, by the laws Congress makes regarding the Judicial Department. And the Impartial Examiner basically says, why isn't this outright determined in the Constitution itself? Just write down how the Judicial Department is supposed to work. You write down how the executive works, and you write down how the legislative works, and then you don't write down the Judicial Department, you just say it's up to Congress. Well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So that is a very brief overview of the Impartial Examiner. Make sure you hit like and subscribe.